Is there a supreme being, a creator of all things, a God? Some say that no question is more vital, determining meaning, purpose, even life after death. Others say that no question is more archaic, born of myth and pre-science ignorance. I think a lot about whether there is or even can be such a supreme being. Cultural traditions, group norms, personal feelings all affect belief or non-belief in God. But can arguments, reasons, flows of logic, ways of thinking cut through traditions, norms, feelings? How do believers and non-believers muster arguments for and against God? This time, I put the question to believers. What arguments do believers use? How to argue for God? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I've addressed God's existence before, but I'm always ready for more, pushing believers and non-believers, seeking from each fresh ways of knowing. Here's why this time I put the question to believers. Believers bear the burden of proof. Believers are the ones making the affirmative argument, proclaiming the existence of an unknown entity that cannot be perceived by the senses or science. I go to the University of Oxford, England, to meet Alister McGrath, professor of science and religion. A scientist by training and a theologian by vocation, Alister is familiar with arguments. Alister, I'm not embarrassed to admit I do not know whether God exists, but I would like to know whether God exists. I like to look at arguments because arguments are like scalpels that can tease apart reality. What can we learn about God from some of the arguments about God?
Well, I think the first thing to say here is that clearly people see it as important to show that belief in God is rational. We want to show that faith does make sense. You're not hanging your brains up when you start thinking about God. This actually is about an extension of this great human enterprise of trying to understand the world we're in.
Yeah. So some have said that faith should be so strong it should eliminate rationality. And that you do not agree with?
No, I don't. For me, faith and rationality go hand in hand. Faith, if you like, goes beyond reason but doesn't contradict it. First of all, we need to realize that in real life there are very few things we can prove. The issue is probability rather than proof. In other words, is there a good case for thinking that this is right? And something like God, what we're out to do is to show, look, this makes sense. There seems to be some good reasons for thinking this, even though it doesn't take us the full way. If we look at classic arguments for the existence of God. For example, Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways from the 13th century. In many ways, they are not proofs in the modern sense of the word. Proofs is what you do in mathematics and logic. What Aquinas is doing is arguing. He's saying, look, if there were a God, then it makes sense of, for example, our observations of change in the world, our sense that there is this thing called good and it's worth pursuing. So what Aquinas is really doing is not trying to prove there is a God, but to say, hey, this idea makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
But how about in religions themselves? I mean, there are very strong differences.
I think all faiths have their own internal logic. In other words, there is a certain rationality that they possess. And this rationality is a way of looking at things, and inevitably there are debates about how this rationality is applied to this idea or that idea. And what I think we need to appreciate is that although the Enlightenment said there's only one rationality, and by the way, we've got it, I think in recent years we've come to realize there are a lot of rationalities. And one of the issues we face is trying to evaluate competing understandings of what it means to be rational. And that's part of the reason why these religious disputes happen.
But what has happened is that the more we've done that, the more Christianity has split into more and more fragments. They may all call themselves Christian, but they all feel they're quite different from each other.
I think we just have to say that trying to find the best way of looking at things is a fundamental human instinct. And it's not saying that's wrong. It's saying we need to be gracious towards each other as we try to navigate our way towards the best conceptual outcome.
Alister begins arguing for God with the idea that belief in God is rational, while faith must be involved because God cannot be proved in a scientific or logical sense. Rational thought is still required to know God. So far, I follow. I myself am motivated more by rational thought than by feelings of faith. So here's my problem. How then do I relate the conflicting claims about God with the accepted facts about science? So the next step for me is to look to what God, if there is a God, created, if there is a creator. I look to the universe, its fundamental structure, macro and micro. Still seeking believers, I go to London to meet physicist Russell Stannard. How does the universe affect his belief?
Russell, not only are you a believer, but you come from a rigorous scientific background. What are the methodologies that allow us to properly approach the question, does God exist?
You might be looking for some kind of evidence which is absolutely knockdown proof. That happens, therefore you must believe in God. It's certainly true that in science there are occasions when things are absolutely clear-cut. But even in science, there are situations, particularly if you're dealing with the big questions, like how did the universe begin? How did humans evolve? It's not like that, and it's a bit like that with God. What you have to do is to build up a case. So, for example, all of the scientists now believe that the world began with a Big Bang. Mm-hmm. Now, why? Where's the knockdown proof? Well, all the galaxies are moving apart from each other. The further away the galaxies, the faster they're receding into the distance. So if you run the tape backwards, everything was squashed together at a point. Therefore, a Big Bang took place. No, because when that was the only piece of evidence, there were many people who subscribed to a different cosmology, what was called the steady state theory, where, all right, things expanded, but new matter formed and new galaxies were formed. There was no beginning point. What then happened was that if there had been a Big Bang, one could argue, well, there would be a blinding flash of light, and that light must be around in the universe somewhere, cooled down now, and when you look, sure enough, you see it. It's the microwave background radiation. Mm-hmm. Then you say, well, okay, that then is the knockdown piece of evidence. And the answer is certainly not. If all you knew was that there was this radiation, there were so many other sources of radiation out there, that wouldn't be proof. But you've now got two pieces of evidence. And in fact, these days we've got 5 or 6 almost independent pieces of evidence. Each one of those indications could be knocked down by some ad hoc explanation, which just explains that one thing. But the Big Bang hypothesis explains all 5 in one go. Now, that is how I see belief in God, evidence for God. You look at a whole variety of things, starting, for example, with the fact that there is a universe. Why is there something rather than nothing? Answer, God. Well, not everybody's convinced by that. Then you say, okay, well, just look at this universe. It seems to be fine-tuned for life. You know, if you just threw together laws of nature at random, you wouldn't have life. You know, but then someone comes along and says, yes, but you could have lots of universities all run and do. So you can knock that one off. But then what about people's religious experience? You know, they feel that they're talking to someone. You know, answers to prayer.
I can make lots of psychological and sociological explanations.
Absolutely. But the God hypothesis knocks the whole lot down in one go. And I do not see that as being terribly different to the way things are in my life as a scientist.
Would it be a fair question to ask you to compare the 5 or 6 arguments to demonstrate the Big Bang and the 5, 6, or however many arguments or methods of explanation to affirm your belief in God, as to which are the stronger?
Well, I think the problem is, you see, that although there are these similarities, there is a big difference, namely that some of these, the evidences for God, are subjective. But the fact that it's subjective doesn't make it, for me, any the less real. Like, for example, I love my wife. I know, not I believe, I know that I love my wife. And the fact that I can't convince you because you don't have that experience doesn't alter the fact that it is real and it is true. Now, I feel that about my belief in God. I know I'm not alone. Now, unless you experience the same thing yourselves, you haven't a clue what I'm talking about.
I guess I can imagine what it feels like to know I'm not alone, but why should I trust my own feelings? People don't feel alone in haunted houses, and there aren't any real ghosts around. I'm not doubting Russell, I'm doubting myself. While Russell's best internal evidence for God is subjective personal experience, his best external evidence for God is the universe. To his credit, he is careful not to count the universe as proof of God. If the universe represents what God may have created, how to represent what God may be? For this, I inquire of Islam, with its rich tradition of glorifying God's grandeur. I visit Islamic scholar Mahmoud Ayoub. Mahmoud, in Islam, what is the nature of God?
God is. It's difficult to answer the question, does God exist? Because if existence becomes a limitation on God's nature, then we cannot deny existence, but we would have to explain it. God's purpose in creating all things is in order that all things may worship or glorify God. The Quran says, there is nothing in creation but that it hymns God's praise, but we do not understand the manner of its glorification. And the human responsibility towards God, this transcendent, unknowable, yet imminent, knowable being, is that they must learn to appreciate what we may call, or decipher what we may call, the signs of God in creation. And God has many names in Islam. The 99 names of God are quite well known. And one of these names is God as the truth, the absolute truth. And that bears really on then our religions. How are they to be regarded in comparison with the absolute truth that is God? Our religions, all of them, are truths only in as much as they relate to or participate in the manifestation of God, the absolute truth. But in themselves, they are relative truths. They are ways to God and not God himself. God, the Quran says, is above the highest heaven, but he is so near to human beings that he is closer to a human being than his jugular vein.
God in Islam seems more transcendent, even beyond existence, because existence is not a category in which God can be contained. But God is still imminent, closer to us than we are to ourselves. Describing God as a radically transcendent and imminent being may not seem on its surface as an argument for God. But to me, descriptions of God are arguments for God. Because if there is a God, God must go radically beyond our imaginations. Anything less would not pass the God test. There remains one final step that God to be God may have to take. Because even if God were majestically transcendent, God would still require a large leap to be a necessary being, meaning that it would be impossible for God not to exist. Can God be a necessary being? I asked philosopher of religion Timothy O'Connor, author of Theism and Ultimate Explanations.
So you and I and everything around us we think of as being the sort of things that needn't have existed. Objects, right? Particular things. My parents might not have met. Had they not met, there wouldn't be me. And when you start to think your way back in history, all the factors, both human choices and large-scale cataclysmic events that altered human history, had any of those not occurred, there wouldn't have been me either. So I am what philosophers call a contingent being. And our universe is constituted by a bunch of things like that. Some very big and long-lasting contingent things like our sun, but even our sun might not have existed had the early stages of our universe been slightly different. So it seems like the universe as a totality is something that might not have been. But then the question this naturally gives rise to is, well, why is it then? If you're going to explain that, you're going to have to be able to invoke the idea of something that simply must be, that gave rise to the things like us that are dependent things that need not have existed.
A terminus of explanation, a final stop on
Precisely.
the road to explanation. There has to be a stop.
Yes.
And that being is something necessary that exists.
That's right.
What could it be?
Well, if we're supposing that there is such a being precisely in order to account for the universe that we inhabit, then we have to look at the supposed effect of this being and say, what can we learn from looking at the nature of our universe that might offer clues? Because we have, I think, at bottom, two fundamentally different ways of explaining particular events in the world. There's explanation in terms of persons who have purposes and form choices. That's a fundamental style of explanation. Call it a personal explanation, a belief, desire-based explanation. And then we have, in our fundamental physical sciences, an impersonal, sort of mechanistic, causal explanation. And the question is, what should we suppose the necessary being? Is it more like some kind of impersonal physical system, or is it more like a personal reality? Well, one thing we do know about our universe, we seem to know, based on our contemporary physics, is that our universe is exquisitely fine-tuned for the existence of life. Now, if you think that's a really striking fact about our universe, that there is intelligent, purposive life, and if there's a necessary being that gave rise to such a universe, it can't just be by happenstance that it gave rise to that particular universe.
I mean, there are explanations. There could be an infinite number of universes, and there's the selection effect. But you're using this as a way of already having a necessary being and then trying to identify that necessary being.
Yes. I'm aware of these alternative strategies, but I don't think they work in the final analysis. If all we were trying to do was to account for the fine-tuned character of our universe, that might be adequate. But there's still a more fundamental question. Why is reality that way, now this much bigger way? Why is there a multiverse? Is a question that we might ask. And I think to answer that question, ultimately you're going to have to say it's the product of something that had to be, so that there's not a need for further explanation of that thing. Can we know anything more about it? Well, what is the putative effect? When we see this exquisite fine-tuning as a feature of our universe, it's the sort of thing you would expect a personal reality, if there were such a reality, to go for. Right? You would, especially if it takes fine-tuning to bring about persons. That's the kind of target that one might expect an intelligent, purposive being to have in creation, because we think persons are a very unique, special feature of our universe. If, on the other hand, necessary being were an impersonal reality, it's hard to see why its nature would just happen to be such as to give rise to something having this very unique yet exquisitely fine-tuned feature.
Maybe not guaranteed.
Here's how Tim argues for God. He starts with contingent beings, beings that did not have to exist, like planets and people. He then reasons that a final explanation of why contingent beings exist must be a necessary being. But what kind of thing is a necessary being? Two choices: personal or impersonal. He then calls on the fine-tuning of the universe, which enables human persons to exist, to conclude that the necessary being is personal. I like the argument, hope it works, but two questions disturb me. First, why couldn't existence have only contingent beings and no necessary being? This would not seem a contradiction or be otherwise impossible. Second, why should a personal explanation have the same prior probability as an impersonal or mechanistic explanation? Although I here focus on how believers argue for God, because I rely on rational arguments, I must ask what science tells us, if anything, about how to argue for God. I turn to one of my intellectual heroes, Nobel laureate in physics, Steven Weinberg.
I think that there is a tendency, and Einstein was particularly culpable in this, to use the word God metaphorically in such a way as to give the impression of a happy reconciliation between science and religion. I don't buy that. I think there are deep and profound tensions between science and religion, and I would rather not use the word God in any way that suggests any kind of grand unification.
Do you see boundaries for science? And to you, what would they be?
Well, science deals with what is, with questions of fact. It has nothing to say about questions of value or morality. There's it seems to me, unbridgeable gulf between the is and the ought. The fact that science has nothing to say about what ought to be, but only about what is, has left many people dissatisfied with science, people feeling that science isn't enough to build a life on. And I agree with that. It's not. It's just a part of it. It's a very nice part of my life, but it's only a part of it. There are lots of other things. And some people have turned to religion as filling up the rest of what they need. I don't find that satisfactory. In the first place, that historically, religion has not done a very good job of telling us what we ought to do. But on a deeper level, the message of especially the great Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, seems to me fundamentally immoral, in that instead of taking as the highest ideal that we should be good and kind and loving to each other, it replaces it with an ideal of obedience and worship of a God who surely doesn't need our support. So that the ideal is Abraham, who at God's command is willing to sacrifice either Isaac if you're a Jew or Christian, or Ishmael if you're a Muslim. That seems to me utterly repugnant. People seem to me to be searching for a big truth to fill their lives. And so they turn to religion, or they turn away from religion to some other big truth like Marxism or Maoism or laissez-faire capitalism. And I think the human race has to grow up and give up the search for a big truth in human affairs. So whatever religion you have, if religion means a set of assumptions of fact about God or the afterlife, you still have to choose what your system of values is. Now, of course, many people in the world today choose the will of God over the common human choice of loving each other and living in peace, and they obey the commands of God to destroy the infidel. And they're, in my mind, making the wrong choice. And I think the world would be better without the religious commands, but with the common human understanding of what is right and wrong.
Steven Weinberg is an atheist, and I'd hope to be a theist. But I'd be disappointed if God, if there is a God, did not respect Steve and like him too. Everyone should appreciate how to argue against God, and everyone should appreciate how to argue for God. But because believers posit an unknown entity, I lay onto their shoulders the burden of proof or inference. It can be rational to believe in God, but that does not mean that God really exists. There can be no absolute proof of God, and while personal experience of God convinces many, I personally remain wary. If I'd go with God, I'd gain from Islam God's ineffable transcendence. But no matter what I may think about God, regarding religion, my attitude skews to Steve's. If required to divulge my view, right now I'd say there is a necessary being, and it is in some sense personal. But here, please believe me, my view is not necessarily closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.